Back to another Truth Factor discussion. I hope everyone is doing well today. Looks like I may have jumped in just a little bit quick on that fade in. Hope that you're having a wonderful week, and I guess you're probably getting ready for the weekend, the holiday weekend that's coming upon us real quick, and something to maybe enjoy time with your family. But here this morning, we're going to be continuing in our study through the Gospel of John. We are in John chapter 20, verse 1. And before we start the study, let me remind you that if you have any thoughts or comments you'd like to share with us, we'd love to hear them. You can drop them in the comment on the Facebook side of the world or in the chat area over on YouTube. And you can even email us if you would like. You can send the emails to questions@truthfactor.com, or you can email us individually there also, John at, Paul at, etc., truthfactor.com. We would definitely love to hear from you. Morning, gentlemen. It's good to have some of you with us here today. We're missing Tom and Bob and Brendan. Brendan probably won't join the study again until we are done with John, which might be another maybe 3 more weeks, not counting next week because we'll be off. But then once we are done with John, we'll figure out where we're headed to next. Maybe some topical studies that we haven't really looked at in a while. We might talk about that. And then Brendan will be joining us more than likely at that point. All right, let's see. Let's go ahead and, any thoughts about this, what we're about to look at? So we have Jesus. He has now died upon the cross, and they've taken him and they have placed him in the tomb. They were not able to fully prepare his body for burial. There was some that was done as we kind of looked at that, but here in just a little bit, some ladies are going to be returning back to the tomb to go and see the body and finish the preparation process there for his permanent entombment. But when they get there, they'll find something completely unexpected. Any thoughts or comments about that? Let me mute my phone real quick. Sorry. There we go. Okay. So let's go ahead and start with verse 20 or verse 1. Let's read from chapter 20, verse 1 through verse 10. Mr. Caleb, would you mind reading that for us? And I think you'll be reading from the New American Standard Version.
Yes, sir.
All right, let me get that brought up here real fast.
95 specifically.
Is there any other of value?
Yeah, right.
All right, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, John chapter 20, verse 1, he says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. So she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.' So Peter and the other disciple went forth, and they were going to the tomb. The two were running together, and the other disciple ran faster than Peter and came to the tomb first. And stooping and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but did not go in. And so Simon Peter also came following him and entered the tomb, and he saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself." Verse 8, he said, "So the other disciple who had first come to the tomb then also entered, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise again from the dead. So the disciples went away again to their own homes."
All righty, thank you, sir. Let's see. Let's cut over to that view right now. All right, so Caleb, when we start this section here, we talk about, he says it's on the first day of the week. In their recollection of when the day started and the day ended, didn't they view it a little bit differently than the way we do it today?
Yeah, I believe they start at the beginning of the day when the sun rises, correct?
Or is it? I often thought, I often heard, I thought
yeah,
that
it starts at sunset.
At sunset the
Starts
day,
at
what we would
sunset.
call the day before. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because see, you're right. When we look at this, I'm thinking, because of the way we kind of count and recollect time here, that she, got there at 4 o'clock in the morning, at the start of the day. But it may be if they counted the day as starting at what we'd call 6 in the afternoon the day before, if that's 6 to 6, then she's trying to get there before sunup, or would be getting there just prior to sunup, I would think. But what's interesting about this, although it was dark, she found that the stone had already been rolled away.
Yeah.
In
Well, it shows her
Great.
eagerness and devotion that she's going to show
Yeah.
up that early and wants to be there first. Now, the other gospels mention, the other women also. Mary, the mother of James, and Salome and Joanna. So John kind of simplifies the narrative. He just emphasizes Mary's, you know, is there and sees this. I always find that interesting. People want to point out discrepancies in the accounts.
Yeah.
I think John is just simplifying the narrative for us.
Well, do we want to take a minute and look at all the I say all the other accounts, kind of take a moment and read the other records of this. You want to give that
It's,
a whirl?
it's good to know. It's good to know that there's a lot of different things going on. It's a lot
Yeah.
to read too, but it is good to know that the other records, as Caleb well said, that there's a lot of other people that are there. In my opinion, is that since John is the last one to have written his gospel, there's a great chance Mary Magdalene was the youngest of those women, and maybe she's the only one still alive. There's also a historical tradition that says that John married Mary Magdalene. And of course, that's, as I said, that's a tradition. Something that was written down in the first or second century that we don't have. It's not a biblical truth, but that would be interesting if that was the case. That it would connect. It would connect.
Yeah.
Why she's the witness here. But I think it's probably most likely she's the only one that might still be alive. And all of these men wrote things with an avenue of witness verification. So that's one of the incredible things about the gospel accounts, that they all wrote with this falsifiable data that you could then go back and verify.
Someone can go
the thing
talk to her.
Yeah. Well, the thing you always point out is, the other three gospels were already written when John writes. So
Yeah.
we should already know all this other information.
Mhm.
He's filling in the gaps. And of course,
Yeah.
Mark, Matthew includes Matthew 28 verse 1. He says, "Now after the Sabbath at the beginning, it began to dawn toward the first day of the week." So I think the sun is rising. That's what I was talking about.
Yeah.
Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. So, and he explains, how the stone got moved by the angel.
Yeah.
And John doesn't include that. The stone's just gone. So I think that's interesting.
So you have Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene, Salome, who might have been the mother of James and John, and there was one more. Who am I missing? Let's see
Joanne?
real quick. Huh?
Joanna, yeah.
Joanne?
Maybe, yeah. Because
There's
Mark
Mary-
has
Mary of Clopas, Mary Magdalene, Salome, and Mary, Jesus's mother.
and then
now this is where
is that Mary, the mother of James?
I think Clopas and James might be the same person, yeah, or
Okay.
the wife of Clopas. And I'm sorry, not the same person, but Clopas might have been their father.
Okay.
So that's also in like Matthew 19:25, and it's interesting because that's where we get the idea that James and John's mother is Mary's sister. So we say that's why it seems that James and John would be first cousins to Jesus.
Yeah. And Joanna's in Luke's account. There's Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them.
Yeah.
So I guess kind of the point to make from this is that and it's already been said, there's a lot going on. There's more than just one person going to the tomb early in the morning. You have this group of women coming to the tomb and being perplexed as to how do we get the stone out of the way, because no one's there with us to do it. But yet when they get there, they find the stone is already moved. Any thoughts about that? Lori points out real quick that Luke 24, verse 10, does kind of talk about what you were mentioning there, Caleb, being early dawn. You know, just kind of, I wouldn't think the break there.
Matthew and Luke both mentioned that, yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's see. So when they get to the tomb there, they find the stone, of course, has rolled away. And John, again, in his brevity, says, they saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. Then she ran and came to Simon Peter. So I was thinking about this earlier. This tomb is going to be somewhere outside of the city of Jerusalem, roughly. And the question is, where were they coming from? Were they coming from Bethany, which was a couple of miles away? Or could they have been staying inside the city of Jerusalem, or maybe up on the Mount of Olives, and then coming in? Because wherever she runs to, wherever they're staying at, we kind of picture it as, it only took her 5 minutes to get there. You know, but it wasn't enough that she could run, and then Peter and John could both run back to see it. And of course, John's the faster runner, apparently. But she goes to Peter, and that's what she says. They've taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have laid him. And then, as you read, Peter and John, they both go, they run. John outruns Peter. There's this some preacher guy on one of the social media platforms, does little skits, Bible skits and everything. And he has a lot of fun with the fact that John recorded the fact that he was faster than Peter, you know, in this. But when we get to the tomb, though, what is interesting, let me bring it up here. So they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. And he, stooping down, looking in, he sees the scene. But when Peter gets here, following him, Peter goes into the tomb. To the first there. No flashlights. They would have carried candles with them. And it's already break of day. Maybe the interior of the tomb was illuminated. So, any thoughts about that?
You know, the only other thing that jumps to my mind, I think is really interesting, is that when early in the morning, Jesus is risen from the grave. Back in Leviticus 23, it says this is also the time where the priest is required to go in before in the temple and wave the wave offering. This is Leviticus 23, 10, and 11. It was the day after the Sabbath of the Passover. And he waves this, and this is the very first fruit. And so it's kind of neat that Jesus is the first fruit of the resurrection, we're told several times in the New Testament. And so, you know, while Jesus is rising from the grave as the first person to be resurrected, they're doing this symbolic waving of a sacrifice that kind of parallels that. I always just think it's kind of neat. You know, I think of these two moments where the priest is going to the temple and Jesus is coming out of the grave, and they're both happening at the same time. You know, I just think it's kind of interesting.
That's why we have Brian with us here on Truth Factor.
For those interesting tidbits that you didn't know.
That's right. All right. Any other thoughts?
I think if you go back to verse 2, you know, when she goes and reports these things to the disciples, he says, "We do not know where they laid him." So although John only mentions Mary, she includes the other women in that statement.
Yeah.
You know, she says we. You know, who is she talking about? Well, you got to go read the other Gospels, who was there. But even she includes you know, there's not a contradiction there. I think it's why, you know, we have to really look at it investigatively and say, well, he just doesn't mention them by name. Because we already know who is there.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point.
I'm not sure I saw that before, but that's really kind of a neat point.
Yeah. What was the distance they were allowed to travel on the Sabbath day? Does anyone remember? Just a wee little bit.
Yeah, on the map it was them. I don't remember.
Well,
There's a Sabbath day journey. But...
Yeah. Well, that's why I hadn't thought about this until I was looking at what Lori made the point. They had to be close enough by that they could run. So then I started thinking, well, it would make sense they would have stayed close because he died, and then they had the Sabbath day. So unless they were able
I got
to
your
journey,
answer, John.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, it's 2,000 cubits. Cubits 18 inches, so that would be about 3,000 feet or 0.6 miles, or just under 1 kilometer.
Okay.
So was that, I'm trying to remember, was that in the old law, or was that one of the traditions of the Pharisees that was passed down, what a Sabbath day journey was?
Well, Numbers 35:5 gives you the distance.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep.
I couldn't remember.
Yeah. That's a good point. And you shall measure outside the city on the east side 2,000 cubits, and on the south side 2,000 cubits, west side 2,000 cubits, north side 2,000. City shall be in the middle. This shall belong to them as common land for the cities. Is that where they're kind of pulling that from?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So the only reason why I asked that is, or kind of
So the
brought the point up.
rabbis formalized that rule, I think, is what they're getting at.
Oh, like in the
You
Talmud?
could only walk that. Yeah, you could only walk that far.
Okay.
Because that's like your home, right? You have
Yeah.
to stay at your home, and they measured that, and they took that passage as the distance of your home. So they took that as the distance you could travel. That makes sense. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So the reason why I brought that point up, then all these people who were there that we see at the tomb would not have even been able to have traveled home, because like Mary and Martha, they lived over in Bethany, and Bethany was about 2 miles away. So if you go from when Jesus was crucified and buried, the next, the Sabbath day, they wouldn't have been able to have journeyed to their home. They would have had to have stayed local in that area, and that would have then put them there local the morning of his resurrection. Just kind of thinking through that. Lori asks about your translation. Caleb, you need to explain yourself. Let me bring that up here a moment. Lori says, what are the asterisks in the verses mean?
Oh, in the 95 version, well, most of the time it'll put it at the bottom. If there's different manuscripts, mine doesn't have a note at the bottom for the asterisks.
I'm kind of making fun of that here. I really think with what the translation I picked up that you were reading from, I think that the asterisks there are going to be within this particular version of it. Let me get back to there again real quick.
Yeah, that's a good question. Mine has an asterisk.
Now, on the first day, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. I've read it before, but I've not seen that many asterisks before.
Yeah, that's a good question. Typically, it'll have a note at the bottom or the sides, but this one doesn't.
All right, so we're blaming this tangent on Lori.
Yeah,
Let's
unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for that in this version.
All right, let's see here. So I see that too, along with the cross references. And so if we look to the beginning of it, guys, I'm sorry. Now I got to know the answer to it.
All right, so I found the answer. It says a star or asterisk is used to mark verbs that are historically present in the Greek, which have been translated with an English past tense in order to conform to modern usage.
Oh, well, that explains everything.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
They say the example would be they go, present tense, into Galilee. we wouldn't say it that way. We would say they went to Galilee. So it's used that as an example to say they've actually changed the tense to make it sound more like the way we would talk about something than it was actually written. It's just a change of the tense of the verb to make it, something a little more fitting to how we would use it.
This is why real Bible students use the New American Standard Bible.
The New King James doesn't have those asterisks.
No,
That's
don't.
why we don't add to or take away from.
That's right. All right, sorry.
Well,
All
the problem is when you start looking at the definitions and it has 4 or 5 different meanings.
Yeah.
And then, somebody's got to come in and say, well, this is the meaning of that word in this context.
Yeah. All right. So I have a quick question. Do y'all know anything about verse 7? There's a reference here, and we'll bring it up again. And the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. There was something that circulated on social media a couple years ago that kind of talked about the specialness of that, but I never quite understood it. Okay.
Yeah, I saw that too, and I don't know. I could never find a reference that made it accurate.
Okay.
I guess the idea is if they came in and stole the body, it'd be all be ruffled up, thrown somewhere. They really described the idea that he woke up, took it off, and put it down.
Folded it neatly. I want to say it had something to do with like a meal or something, or like if you were setting a place for someone, but I don't know.
That's what it said. The idea was that it was an indication that the master was coming back. And like I said, I've never found if that's true or not.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That was what I've read on.
Probably some of the women in my life have, my wife and mom probably would have pointed out that Jesus was very neat. He folded it up and put his things away neatly.
Unless the angels did it.
You don't see it laying on the floor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that's a valid point. Paul and Caleb, you were making a similar point to that. Had the body been stolen, those things would have been just strewn about.
Yeah.
And probably not even laid aside. I mean, they probably just would carried the whole thing out. But here, it intentionally was removed by him and set aside. Okay. I don't know, Lori. She says maybe be due to the fact that he had thorns on his head, the crown of thorns.
I think that would have been removed, right?
Before they buried him?
During the burial process?
Yeah, I would imagine.
But the Shroud of Turin, doesn't it have the crown still on the head?
Yeah, but the Shroud of Turin is one piece. And this is clearly saying there were 2 pieces. So, like I said, if anybody ever wondered if that was accurate, it's impossible for it to have been a valid thing.
For the record, I wasn't bringing it up to show the Turin was evident.
Yeah. All right, Ryan. Well, I mean, sometimes people have asked,
it.
well, do you think that's real? And I say, not according to John. It can't be.
That's right. That's a good point of clarification. Yeah. All right. Let's see. The other disciples who came to the first tomb went in also. So that is John. John, of course, goes into the tomb. And now, verse 8 there. Then the other disciple who came to the tomb first went in also, and he saw and believed. But then verse 9, and this is crucial, for as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. So looking at this earlier, I was kind of wondering, what did John believe? I kind of think he believed the testimony that Jesus was not there. Because she said, come, they've taken his body, he's no longer there, and they get there and he sees that. He believes her report. But could John be talking about that he believed, because this is John, the writer, who's writing this about himself, believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. But then verse 9 kind of makes us wonder about that. What do you think? Okay, they agree with me.
I think... Yeah. Well, I think even in verse 9, they didn't fully understand that scripture, but he believed that Jesus had risen.
Yeah.
I think is what he's getting at in verse 8. Because I saw it and I believed. And you see that different, it takes different evidence for different disciples to believe.
Okay.
Thomas needs more. He needs to see it and touch it You know, that's how some people act today, right? If Jesus would just come back, then I would, if I could see it and I could touch it, then I would believe. And John sees with the least amount of evidence, really, is the empty tomb.
It's interesting
You know,
how John refers to himself. Um, I'm assuming that's humility. I know that the Holy Spirit gave him perfect memory and gave him the words here, but somehow, and I don't know that I can fully explain it, but somehow the Spirit yet uses their personalities and and everything in revealing the message. But that John, here several times, the other disciple does not claim that for himself. For whatever reason, he doesn't say I, or even referring to himself in third person, John. He just says the other disciple. So
When you think about humility and what Jesus was teaching them, washing their feet, that they needed to be humble, serve each other, and they really take that to heart, and the respect and awe they give when they write. I don't want any credit for this.
I would have
write...
probably said I outran Peter and I got to the tomb first.
Yeah.
And I was looking in there when he just burst in. And,
now that really shows, God is in control of the writing, And I think about that all the time during Genesis, and you're reading things, you're like, well, a human would have given more detail, but God is brief for a reason.
Yeah. I will say, years ago, I had this is kind of a morbid story, but we got a call that there was a brother in Christ that wasn't answering his phone or something, and we got to his house and his door was open, and I just knew something had happened to him. And I remember, I don't want to go in until somebody else gets here to help. I just and he was deceased, but it was I didn't want to go in and find him. I remember thinking that, and so I waited for another brother to come. We went in together. But, maybe that's a little bit of John. I don't want to go in and see Jesus there. I don't want to go in and it just really would be a traumatic thing to go in and have his body right there again. So, I don't know. I think there's something very real about the idea that I got there and I couldn't go in. There's just something strikes me about that.
Luke, just kind of as a side cross-reference, in Luke 24:12, but Peter arose and ran to the tomb, and stooping down, he saw the linen clothes lying by themselves, and he departed, marveling to himself at what had happened. So Luke does record the run to the tomb. And it very well may be that what John is saying and what Luke is saying here about Peter, him marveling, might be the equivalent of John saying, and he believed. Yeah. And if we put verse 9, I was using verse 9 as kind of saying, maybe this is the reason why not. And by the way, Stephanie kind of agrees with the idea that it appears to have caused John to believe. And if we bring it back to the context here real quick, and he saw and believed, for as yet they did not know the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. He had told them that he would rise again in 3 days. But I think maybe at this point they realize, okay, those scriptures are now fulfilled. Whereas before his death, they would not have known their fulfillment, maybe.
I mean, how many times do you preach a lesson and then, months later somebody says, oh, this dawned on me. And you're like, well,
Yeah.
How many times have I said that? But okay.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And it is incredible how many times Jesus told them, this is exactly how it's going to happen. And none of them there. What happened? It is remarkable.
Lori says they did not understand at this time that Jesus was going to be raised from the dead. And so now the empty tomb begins to maybe help in their understanding even more. Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts? Verse 10, the disciples went away again to their own homes. Go ahead, Caleb.
It's interesting you see their personalities, that I like Brian's point of why John might have waited too. You see their personalities. Peter's always head first, he's got to go. And he just goes in. I don't, we all know those people, we just act. We don't think sometimes. And Peter seems to do that. He cuts the ear off of the servant. So he's always actions first, think later. And John, kind of waits there for him. So it's interesting to you see their personalities. These are people. We're not just dealing with fictional people. We're dealing with real life emotions, real life people, and how they just shows how real it is.
Yeah, that's a good point. You mentioned, and this is off topic because we've already talked about this, but you mentioned about Peter, cutting off the ear of Malchus, the servant of the
High priest.
high priest. Yeah. We were talking in our young adults class last night. We were in Mark chapter 14. We have Peter saying, Lord, I'll never stumble because of you. I will die for you. And then just a handful of hours later in the garden, Jesus says, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Now, there's a context to that, of course, where they kept falling asleep while he was gone. But then Peter learns that lesson firsthand when he is asked about Jesus and he denies him. The spirit has a lot of great ideas. Yeah, I'll die for you. But then when push comes to shove and you face the true physical challenge, the flesh oftentimes is weak. And I wonder if maybe that statement made by Jesus, although contextually had to do with him not staying awake to watch, might have been a statement that later Peter would recall as, why he denied the Lord. I don't know. Is something to think about. Jimmy, he says here, we'll bring this in. It's also interesting to see the sovereignty of God in these passages, something that some would call luck. However, we see the sovereignty of God. It's a good point. Good point. All right, any other thoughts? All right, let's see. Mr. Brian, if you would, let's start in verse 11, and let's continue forward here. Let's go ahead and read down to verse 18. A little bit longer of a read, but...
Okay. I'll be reading on John chapter 20, 11 through 18 from the New King James Version. But Mary stood outside by the tomb weeping, and as she wept, she stooped down and looked into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had lain. Then they said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? And she said to them, Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. Now when she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? She, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. And Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him, Rabboni, which is to say, teacher. Jesus said to her, Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren, and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Mary Magdalene came and told the disciples that she had seen the Lord, and that he had spoken these things to her.
All righty. Thank you, sir. All right, so we were just talking about how John looked in and believed, okay? But yet Mary, going off John's order here of this, Mary appears to either stay around when the other two leave, or maybe this is happening all around the same time frame. And she looks in, and now she sees two angels in white sitting. Now, I wonder if John and Peter had seen those, would it have been recorded for us? Or is this something that was shown specifically to Mary?
Say that one more time, John. I want to understand that better.
So John and Peter looks in, and at least John doesn't say anything about seeing the two angels in the tomb. Okay, so they assuming this happened in chronological order as John records it. Then the disciples went away and get to their homes, and Mary, she remains there. And Mary looks in and sees two angels in white sitting there in the tomb. And they asked her, Why are you weeping? And so she has a conversation with them that Peter and John didn't have. When Peter and John looked in, the tomb was empty except for the linen garment or the covering there. But yet, in the other gospel accounts, when they get there, they see an angel. I mean, an angel rolls the tomb away, scares the the guards so bad that they're pretty much as dead men. I mean, they're not. I don't think they were dead, but we would use the term they passed out. But they probably used the term they were as dead men, and so they saw that when they first got there. And so I guess what I'm saying is these events may be a little bit out of order the way John is recording them.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I think that's exactly right. I don't think verse 11 is after Peter and John ran to it. It's probably before, would be my thinking, that because the way the other accounts record it. And John is certainly not chronological. I mean, we know that from just about everything John puts together, that so many events are not in a chronological order. So, it's almost certainly not the order it had. Well, I say that. I mean, it seems very, very likely that the other accounts are putting us in order, but John is not. So I can easily see that, they ran in, they looked, they saw it, they had this conversation. They go back, they see Jesus again, and then they tell the apostles, and then Peter and John run and look and don't see anything. And I think that that's probably the most likely chronological order. You get that out of Luke. And
The only problem I have with that, Brian, is she says they stole the body. So she didn't fully understand that he had risen when she goes and gets Peter and John. And it seems like, if you take it in that order, then the order is
they would have known. Yeah. Well, and it could be that this does split. Maybe there is genuinely a split, because Mark says that Jesus first appears to Mary Magdalene, and excluding her from the rest of the women. And then he mentions that he appears to all the women. So to me, it's almost as though the group's split. Like the women are going back, they meet Jesus, and Mary is separated from them somehow, and she meets Jesus. But you're right about that. I hadn't thought about that. You do say they took the body. And all I can say is, I imagine you're probably just saying a lot of things. I can imagine that you met Jesus and you're still thinking, maybe someone took the body. Or, I've been in situations where I've got very flustered and just, I'm not repeating the facts in a coherent way because if it's a very highly charged situation, maybe that's true.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right, Caleb. It's not easy to reconcile, is it? It's kind of interesting.
Well, Well, I always look at it as they all left, and she's the only one that stayed. And then he reveals himself to her. And in Matthew 28, he records that he appeared to the other women.
That's why I said earlier, do we need to read all the accounts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think what you're saying though would be, is in generally putting it, they got there in the morning. The tomb was open. Some maybe left right then to go back and report, or maybe they went back to report and they come back and then they see the angel. But yet Peter and John do. So it's, but it's not. Don't view it as a contradiction. What you're viewing as, these were eyewitnesses testifying as to what they saw. And sometimes in the testimony of eyewitnesses, it's not exactly the same thing. There are things that overlap because they are remembering the same thing. But many times the order is a little bit different. And the writer focuses on something. John's focuses on, and y'all have already pointed this out, John is focusing on something very specific, whereas the others may have chosen to bring out other details that John was not inspired to bring out.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's neat that, Mark just drops you this, he appeared to Mary Magdalene first. And I would say, now Caleb's rattled me a little bit, but I still think, it's probably recording that first appearance here would be the most likely scenario, that this is somehow that first appearance. And, and maybe Mary's a fast runner too. She runs there and back while the lady's just kind of standing around there in shock. And it's interesting. They're all clear about the two men inside. One of them mentions there's one man outside. I think somebody once told me, I always liked the way they said it. They said there were just angels everywhere. They were just, and he said, if this is something that angels desire to look into, maybe a lot of angels wanted to see what was happening. It's kind of an interesting way it's happening.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Any additional thoughts on that before we kind of walk through what we've just read here? Paul,
Well,
you got any?
if you reconcile all of them, we know Mary Magdalene, John 20:11 through 18. She's the first one he appears to.
Yeah.
Which is pretty significant that he appears to a woman first.
Right.
You know, the lesser in their culture, and he's going to appear to her first, and then the other women second. So, he doesn't appear to the men until later, which is interesting.
That's a point that
Yeah.
I recently made here in Ellisville, Indiana, is that some of the women played a very important role in Jesus's work and in his ministry. We read about how it was women who contributed to and helped along as he was doing different things, and you often find the women mentioned. And here, even in the greatest event of all time, the resurrection, that here is a well, John mentions Mary. We find, some of the other accounts do mention other women who were part of this, and that they were among the first, and they were the ones to announce it when others would refuse to believe. And I just think it's a really good thing for us to realize what an important part that women played. I'm not suggesting they take the leadership role or any of the more modern issues that we've come across, but I do see here of how much Jesus valued women. He didn't view them as second-class citizens. He didn't view them as unimportant or anything like that. He saw their part in this very important. The Spirit here revealing to us about these details. It's just really very significant, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. Very good point. All right, let's see. So the two angels, of course, they ask her. She's weeping outside. She stooped down, looked in. They asked her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" And she says, "Because they've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him." Now, when she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Do you think it's possible that, well, I won't even go there. Any thoughts about this? Jesus himself is asking her, why, what are you looking for? Who are you seeking? Why are you crying? And she makes that statement there. They've carried him away. Tell me where they've taken him, and I'll take him to another location. And then Jesus calls her by name. Any thoughts about this?
Well, it shows that he knew who she was.
Yeah.
And Jesus remembers his life on earth.
Yeah. That's right. It's still him. It's still him.
Yeah.
And when you look at this, at first she doesn't appear to recognize him, but she's in a state of, she's crying, she's upset, and she's not.
Has she even looked at him?
Right. And she's not expecting him to walk up behind her or walk up to her and talk to her.
Yeah.
At least the way she reacted kind of indicates that. And then he said, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended my Father." Any need to discuss something that we don't understand? Or or do you think it's a simple statement?
For a little bit. Yeah, I think I'm going to be here for a minute. I'm not leaving yet. So
we might add that we know that when Jesus died, he didn't go to heaven. He's telling us here that he hasn't yet gone to the Father.
That's true. All he did was told the thief he'd see him in paradise, but we don't know the full.
Yeah, right. It says in Acts 2 that he was in Hades, which is not hell, but the place, place of the dead.
Yeah. But he just says, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father, but go to my brethren and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God." based on our current understanding, I would automatically look towards the 40-day point later when he actually sends up into heaven. But could he be referencing something before this point? And that's what people have talked about with this. Whatever form he was in, he didn't want her touching him and holding him. I don't know if that's accurate enough.
No, I think that's reading too much into it.
Yeah. But something we won't have time to really get into. But he's going to tell her, go tell my disciples they'll see me in Galilee. Well, Galilee's about a 3 or 4 day journey from Jerusalem, and one thing I think Brian, in our kind of discussion ahead of time, you pointed out that he only appears before them just a handful of times, and so they've got to make this journey up to Galilee, where the last time they'll be with him will be up there in Galilee, and so we don't have him here on this earth walking with them side by side over the next 40 days. We have him appearing to them, to the multitudes and everything. And maybe that has something to do with what he's saying here in verse 17 too.
It's interesting as you break down the accounts. There's like 10 to 11 appearances of Jesus recorded. We talked about Mary Magdalene near the tomb.
Mm-hmm.
And you have the other women near Jerusalem. And then you have the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus in Luke 24. And he has that long teaching conversation that they didn't fully recognize him the whole time. So he was, hiding himself, it would appear. Then you have Peter in Jerusalem, Luke 24:34. And, Paul mentions it in 1 Corinthians 15:5 that he appeared there. So you have multiple accounts. Then you have the 10 apostles, without Thomas, in John 20:19 through 23, in the upper room in Jerusalem. So then there looks like they're in the same room 8 days later with Thomas.
Yeah.
So how big of a gap?
And
so between 6 and 7, so John 21 is when he talks about it at the Sea of Galilee.
Yeah.
And of course, we have a 40-day period. We got to fill in all the gaps, right?
Yeah. Well, that's what. And
yeah.
In Matthew 28, he is at a mountain there in Galilee, where he's given them the what we call the Great Commission. So I guess that's kind of the point. What makes him different from Lazarus is that Lazarus arose from the grave and he went back to eating pork chops and applesauce with probably wouldn't have been pork chops. Sorry. He went back to eating meals with his sisters and everything. But with Jesus, it was more than simply his body coming back. There was much more to this, and we see it within his power of being able to be determined appearances so that the people would know that he was risen from the grave.
Well, you see it when he appears to Thomas that the holes are still in his hands or his wrists, and the hole's still in the side. So it's not like he regenerated a new body or something.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, he's in the same body,
and that same body should have been dead.
Yeah, we have to be clear that Jesus is the first person in history to be resurrected, which is not to say raised, brought back to life, but the transformation process of resurrection too has to be involved in that as well. So it is complicated, and of course, the point we make is the wounds in the body, but I'm not sure I understand that entirely. In part because we have some pretty straightforward. He walked with them on the road to Emmaus. They don't know who he is. He's talking to Mary here. They don't know who he is. You would think if somebody has scar wounds all over their head and they've been beaten for hours, they're going to be swollen and bruised. That if he bears these wounds all the time, that would be a pretty distinct. I was talking to this guy on the road. It looked like he'd been beaten half to death, but they don't even catch that. So I don't know. I don't understand that. Perhaps it's even the case he just manifested those wounds for Thomas to see. but maybe he didn't walk around with them all the time. I don't know. I'm really perplexed
Yeah,
by, I don't understand exactly what's happening here. But I do always want to make the point. He is the first of the resurrection. The apostles say, whatever our resurrection is like, Jesus, it's like him. And he can go through walls, he can go through locked doors, he can be in one place and then another. He can eat. So there's something physical and tangible to him, but there's also something supernatural to him, which is just all lots of ways of saying, I don't really understand exactly what we're looking at here, but.
Yeah. What is that new body like, Brian? Give us details. Yeah.
And isn't it funny? I mean, the apostles say, we don't know what it's like. John says in 1 John 3, we don't know what it's like. And I think that's what's interesting is, it's like him, but, I think that's really catching to me that, we don't actually know what it's like.
All right, let me bring in a couple comments and then a passage, if I can remember where it's at, kind of touching on what you're talking about. Stephanie. Stephanie says her attitude is very courageous in declaring that she wanted Jesus' body. It's a very, very good point with that. And then Lori says, one point we do know is that all the accounts are true and accurate. That's right. Our discussion about not being able to answer certain alignment challenges should not be interpreted as we question the authenticity and authority of the scriptures. All scripture is given by inspiration of God, but God used men to record these scriptures. It wasn't just like a typewriter and the Lord was, these men were given what to say and was allowed to use their own voices, their own language, their own mannerisms, but it still conveys the truth from the Word of God. Yeah.
I think sometimes our inability to answer is more of a testimony to the validity of it than not.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. One other point, real quick. I'm forgetting where Paul makes the point in the epistles that Jesus was basically the firstborn of all creation. You're talking about his resurrection, or maybe he was the firstborn of the resurrection.
He's the first fruit of the resurrection, right?
First fruit. That's why I couldn't find it. Yep. I was looking for
and he's
firstborn.
The firstborn. Colossians 1:15 is he's the firstborn of creation, but then the first fruits of the resurrection. Actually, he's called the firstborn of the dead too in Revelation 1. So.
Firstborn.
Also, Colossians 1:18 says firstborn from the dead.
No, firstborn from the dead. So there's two places where it's firstborn from the dead.
There you go. Okay.
Of course, that's
not
what he's
because
talking
I'm
about.
that brilliant, but because I have a really nice electronic
Me
Bible.
too. Me too. I wouldn't say that though, Paul. I want people to think I'm brilliant. But yeah. That's exactly
Well,
right.
I was looking at firstborn as two words. I'm seeing now it's one word. So
Yeah,
language failure.
First fruits. It's interesting that first fruits is in the same chapter, and he's talking about where Jesus appeared and who he appeared to.
Yeah.
He appeared to the 500. He appeared to
1
James,
Corinthians
the
15.
Lord's brother. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he became
All
the
right.
first fruits of those who have fallen asleep.
Yeah. And so that goes back to what Brian was talking about. Lazarus was raised from the dead. Jesus was the first to be resurrected.
Yeah.
And when we are buried with Christ through baptism, when we are born again, there is that spiritual resurrection that we go through. And he was the first.
Yeah, that's called the first resurrection in Revelation 20, right? When we're baptized, It's the first resurrection.
Yeah.
Well, and of course, maybe one thing we can just kind of to make it a little easier too. Lazarus died again, the widow of Nan's son died again, and even the people that Elijah and Elisha raised from the dead died again. Every one of them. But Jesus is never going to die again. When we're resurrected, it's the immortality. And that's the biggest distinction is that there's a tremendous difference in the body that we're raised in. And I always like to say what's interesting is that they don't go in there and find Jesus' old body because he has a brand new one. Somehow or other that body's changed, which is a big deal in 1 Corinthians 15, where he says there's a change that happens. Now, I don't want to go into this too far because then somebody says, well, what if my body's burned up? What if I'm cremated? Well, I don't know, but it's still, there's still a connection to it somehow. But I obviously that's not going to prevent you from being raised from the dead, but I don't understand. I don't understand the resurrection entirely.
Yeah. Well, think about all the tombs. Someone had asked me that question about cremation, but think about all the tombs in Jerusalem, where after a year of the body being laid out, they would collect all the bones and stick them into ossuaries. They'd put them in boxes. So you could have Uncle Bob and Aunt Jemima and Uncle and Cousin Stan, all their bones in one box, with a stone top on top of that, buried somewhere deep in the ground where the ground has collapsed through the centuries, thousands of years. To me, that's the same challenge as cremation. But if God can raise the dead, which He can, whether you're cremated or you're stacked with 100 of your relatives as bones, it's none of that prevents it.
What about people that are fish food? Yeah.
Is what, fish food?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. What if I'm in an explosion? What if I'm in a plane crash? What if there's so many ways the body could be obliterated. Yeah. And number two, I'd say that would mean every atheist out there ought to get themselves cremated if that could stop them from having to face God on the day of judgment. They're not.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me say this. We have this study because we like to study together. We don't come to the study with all the answers. We'll try to prepare ahead of time if possible, but we will question ourselves. We will disagree with each other, and we will come up with questions that maybe we hadn't thought about before that we're not really prepared to answer. But our goal is to study together and hopefully be able to study with you and learn from you, and hopefully you find this beneficial as well. Gentlemen, any other thoughts or comments? All right, we're going to skip next week, so that should be the 10th. I will not be available that day. So our next study will be the 17th of July, Lord willing. That's what we'll target for, or set as our target. And then we will pick up with John chapter 20. Let's pick up in verse 19 and continue forward here with the great resurrection of Jesus Christ and the witnesses who saw it, as well as the message, the commission that He will give to His disciples. I want to thank everyone for joining us for our study today. Feel free to send us any questions you might have to questions@truthfactor.com. That's questions@truthfactor.com or truthfactorlive.com. That also works too. All right, gentlemen, we'll see you back here in 2 weeks, and we'll see you at home, hopefully back here in 2 weeks as well. Y'all have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.